5 of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome to 5 of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series of videos will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films of this chosen year. In today's video we are talking about the year 2011, so let's get started. Before we get into our top 5, here are a few of the honourable mentions from this year. Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Bridesmaids, Fast 5, The Inbetweeners Movie, Warrior, The Raid, Super 8, and The Grey. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. The Guard is written and directed by John Michael McDonagh and stars Brendan Gleeson and Don Cheadle. So, you might be thinking to yourself, like I was whenever I first was told about seeing The Guard, I've never heard of that film in my life. And neither had I. It was only when it was recommended to me by a friend and family member and actually a few people that said, oh, you have to see that, it's brilliant, it's just great, the humour's great, the storytelling's great, just give it a go. Like I always say to you guys with movies, it's always something that, just recommendation, and that's what I'm going to do now for The Guard. Because this film, I seen someone give it the tagline of the Irish Hot Fuzz. It's not that. It's a very vastly different film that, yes, it has the policing element, but that's where the similarities... Well, it's policing and it's a comedy. That's the only similarities. Hot Fuzz is a very different movie and great in its own right. And The Guard is great. The Guard, starring Brendan Gleeson... Let's just talk about Brendan Gleeson first, because you'll probably know him best as Mad-Eye Moody in the Harry Potter franchise and a lot of other roles, some more recent roles, and Brendan Gleeson, this for me personally is his best performance in anything. I think the role suits him absolutely to a T. It is perfection in what they want for this. A Garda officer, in Ireland, it's just having him in that role, the kind of dry humour, that's something that shines throughout. The Irish humour and the dry wit and the kind of catching people off guard with the jokes. It's a hilarious film, and I know in a lot on 5 of the Best we've talked about comedies and being subjective and things like that, and of course that applies to this. Maybe not, maybe the humour in this is more tailored to what I would like than maybe yourself, and that's fair enough. But for me personally, I really, really enjoy The Guard, and it's one of the more closer to home films, as you would imagine, but also just having a comedy that resonates that well, but also tells a good story. And let's get on to Don Cheadle. So Don Cheadle, obviously as Rhodey is probably his most prominent role nowadays, but things way back to things like Boogie Nights and movies from years ago. Don Cheadle has certainly been around the block. And I have to admit, even looking at the posters for this film before I even watched it, I thought, why... Who concocted this? Who thought, let's put Don Cheadle in rural Ireland with Brendan Gleeson as an officer? And it's a match made in heaven. You sometimes get that in films and television shows and just pairings that work so well. On the outset, you wouldn't think it would work as well as it does, but it is just brilliant. The way they bounce off each other, and I know, there's another similarity to Hot Fuzz and the kind of the Cornetto trilogy with the dynamic between Simon Pegg and Nick Frost in those films is the core and the heartbeat, if you like, of those films. With The Guard, it is exactly the same with this. The dynamic between the two characters, but also the way they engage and bring in other characters to the film is just brilliant. The Guard is such an underrated film, and I don't always say that word because I think it gets thrown around too much when it comes to talking to so many movies. But for The Guard in particular, it's something that I was so glad I was recommended, and I'm so glad that I took the time to watch, because not everybody, and again, I'll recommend this to you guys, you might go and watch and go, really wasn't for me. That's fair enough, that's fair. But for me personally, The Guard really hits, it really ticks the right boxes and just does exactly what I wanted in an Irish comedy. The humour really hits home, the dynamic, but also it's an engaging story too. And I know I use that word a lot, the engagement of the audience. But there wasn't a part of this where I felt that it was dragging along. I didn't think it was a slow start or a slow final act. It was just, it's not a long film, it's just the right amount for a comedy. And the comedy's on 5 of the best. I've featured quite a few at this point. And this, again, I talked about this golden era of comedies, kind of 2007 through to 2012, around that time, where there would be a good lot of comedy films. But this is one that actually came, when I got to see this film, it was a lot later. This is 2011. I think I got seeing this film, it could have been 2018, something like that. So it certainly wasn't around that time where I have these real nostalgia love for it. It's just a great quality movie overall, never mind comedy. And having the two, and the director and his directorial debut, just everything ticks the box for this. I was really, really impressed with The Guard, and I would definitely recommend you give it a chance if you're into that kind of comedy. If you're not, maybe not for you, but I would say give it a go. Number 4. Limitless is directed by Neil Berger and stars Bradley Cooper and Robert De Niro. So I can't remember what the scenario was, but whenever this film came out, there was about 20 of us, a 20 group of lads. We all went to see Limitless, and we were in Edinburgh, Scotland. We were on a trip or whatever. I can't remember what it was anyway. But we were there, and so many of us went to see this, and it was basically all of us came out with the same unanimous opinion. This is genuinely one of the coolest movies we've ever seen. Now, time fades it a little bit, and maybe get a bit more educated and things like that. But at the time, I thought Limitless was just the best. It was as simple as that. I just thought Limitless was everything I thought a movie couldn't be, but everything it could be. And now when you go back, and I actually watched this very recently, probably in the last month or so, before I was, in preparation for doing this video, and it's not as good as that. I'll admit, it's not like the greatest film of all time. However, I think it's still great. I think Bradley Cooper in this role, and this is the thing. While Bradley Cooper's great, Robert De Niro also in the kind of supporting role is, well, I mean, saying Robert De Niro's great is saying water is wet, but yes, it goes without saying he's also great, and the dynamic between the two of them and the way they would kind of be opposing forces and then work together and then opposing forces. It's a great dynamic kind of throughout the film. But what this film relies on, and I don't always talk about this because not every film has this. A lot of films are led by performances or dialogue or just or set pieces or things like that. What this film has is a fantastic premise. And this is not, time has passed and now we've had things like Lucy with Scarlett Johansson, which is just a far inferior film, which is, activating more of your brain and what that enables you to do, and that kind of scenario. This was the first film that and I'm not saying this is the first time that this theory or idea has ever been explored, but I think it was the first one that I had ever seen and experienced. I thought that is so cool. Even using that word is so childish, but it just felt like such a cool idea, cool scenario, that if you take this pill, you kind of enable your brain to do anything, remember anything, learn anything in such short times. It's such a brilliant premise and such an engaging premise. And obviously this led to a television show which I watched for a little bit but didn't love, and kind of my love for Limitless has waned a little bit over time. And then watching it again recently, I enjoy it still, and I do think it was. But my point is, and the reason I bring all that up is because if you were asking me in 2011, if I was making this video 11 years ago, 12 years ago, this would be number one, no doubt. There would be no doubt it would have been number one. Like, as soon as I seen him doing 2011 and I'm looking through the movies, Limitless, smack bang number one, no question. But over time, and rewatches and things like that. But coming out of the cinema and in the first impressions, it's one of my favourite films as on a first impression at the time. Maybe it was just right scenario, right place, right time. But let's talk a little bit more in depth about performances and things like that. And somebody like Bradley Cooper, I mentioned there briefly at the start with, he has his leading roles to come. Again, I say like things like American Sniper or something like Silver Linings Playbook, or all the way up to something like A Star Is Born in more recent times. Bradley Cooper has all that to come, and I'm sure he'll appear more and more as Five of the Best goes, certainly for this decade. But for the start of this decade with 2011, and Bradley Cooper as Eddie Morrow in this, or Eddie Morrow? I think it's Eddie Morrow. Yeah, it's something like that anyway. And the way it's integrated into the story. The kind of this helpless man who has nothing going in his life. He's kind of promised the world, and the world eats him up essentially. And he gets offered this life-changing scenario, and he just takes it because he has nothing else. And then what he is able to become over the course of the film and the trajectory of his life, and it just completely turns a corner for him. It's just, again, I go back to that word, it's just a brilliant premise, and not every film has a premise as solid as this, and it's based, I think, quite loosely on The Dark Fields by Alan Glynn, but it is the novelisation, I would imagine, delves a lot more into the effects and the kind of repercussions of the actions of what this pill does in the film. But for the movie side of things, it is kind of drawn up a bit. Then you've got the Russian mafia side of things, and I just think Limitless is really good. And I could try and delve more deeper into what I really love about the film, but I think it all just rides, and I could try and break it down in more things. But I actually find the more I break it down, the maybe more I don't love it as much as I thought. But it just always goes back to that. And it was, as I say, there was about 20 of us lads, and we all came out, and there wasn't any of us. And you would imagine, in that amount of people, most people would go. There was a few that would go, I didn't really like it, wasn't really for me, or I didn't like that, or nitpicking, or most. And if probably like yourselves, if you go with friends or family to a movie, you would have contrary opinions. Usually, you would come out and chat about it and say what you did like and didn't like, and that's one of the best things about a cinema experience. I remember then, and I think that also sold me. It was because all of us, all 20-ish of us, all kind of chatted after it, and it was, that was awesome. That was so cool, and whatever it was. I think Limitless is still a great time, and I think if maybe you'll go into it and maybe you'll have the same experience as we did. Oh my god, that's so cool! Or maybe you've seen something like Lucy, and admittedly that film does take away from this, because that film with Lucy starring Scarlett Johansson, it takes this premise. I know it doesn't take it completely to the T of exactly what the premise is, but it builds on the notion, if you like, of what the brain can do, but then it just goes into quite literally to stupid territory, and it takes you out of the film. Whereas Limitless, yes, it pushes the boundaries, certainly, but it doesn't get to the point where you're going, okay, right, wise up, to stop being stupid. It doesn't get to that point, and that's why I recommend Limitless still. Go and give it a go. If you still, maybe you'll get the experience that I did all those years ago, or maybe not. But either way, I still really enjoy this film, and I don't mind admitting it. It's just Limitless is great. Bradley Cooper's great. Even someone like Aaron Frale, who's in this in a limited role. Andrew Harr is the kind of antagonist. I think this film is not underrated because it has that kind of cult following. It's probably not even the right word to say it's a cult following. It had like a very mainstream audience when it came out, and that obviously led to the television show. But after that, and maybe as a consequence of the TV show, it kind of is waned. But I still really enjoy it.
Number 3.
The Cabin in the Woods is directed by Drew Goddard and stars Kristen Connolly, Chris Hemsworth, Anna Hutchinson, and Fran Kranz. Now, Cabin in the Woods is one of those films that really... It's actually the antithesis to what a generic film is of that genre. And in Cabin in the Woods, you have basically a deep dive and a dissection of the horror genre, and maybe not the horror genre as a whole, but certainly the stereotype and the cliche horror tropes. Because what you get is you get 5 teenagers that go out into it and stay in an abandoned house, and then they get more than they bargained for. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, like I was, and and that exactly is the intention of the filmmakers, is that is basically 90% of every horror film ever made, is that. Or certainly the slasher genre in particular is that's what that's a deep dive of. However, The Cabin in the Woods is probably the smartest dissection of a film I've seen. Because yes, you have things like spoof films, you have things like Scary Movie, or Epic Movie, or Disaster Movie, and for most of them they are a disaster. But for something like the early Scary Movies aren't actually too bad when it comes to spoof films. And you would imagine whenever I'm saying that, saying about like it's a dissection and it's poking fun, maybe. It's not actually. In a weird way, The Cabin in the Woods is one of the best celebrations of horror in recent memory. Because what it does, it explores the genre in a very unique way. It makes the dynamic, and I would say, right, I try not to be too spoilery on this, but it is the premise of the film. So, the 5 friends, teenagers, whatever. I say teenagers, one of them's Chris Hemsworth, and this is just coming into Thor time, so he's obviously built like he's 17 foot, and he's an absolute unit. But, these young teenagers, they go to there, and it's all the very cliche, love interest, and people are arguing with each other. It's all that. But then when the film really gets going and you kind of take yourself away from the generic side of things, and it pulls back and it turns out that this is a game that's played and it's controlled, and it's they conjure up the monsters and creatures and whatever the scenario is, and whatever the most sadistic scenario they can think up, and that's something that because I'd admit, and this is another film, and I know I talked about this a little bit when I was talking about The Guard. This is a film I came to late. The Cabin in the Woods was a film that I got to about, well, I say late. It was 2011, I think I seen it in about 2015, so not too late. But it wasn't a film I seen at the time, certainly. So, seeing The Cabin in the Woods, it brought out everything that I and a lot of people really love about horror, in a way that also pushes down the tropes that we don't like, and kind of bashes the tropes that we don't like. Make it so obvious and make it so, work it into a storyline. It's just smartly written. And me, if you've been following 5 of the Best for the longest time, one of the things I love most about films is when they're finely crafted and they're just smart. They're smart and they work with what the audience, they engage with the audience, they get the audience on side early, and also know the audience. They know if they go into a generic slasher film and they see the start of it, they know they've seen that first half an hour of the film 16. We've seen the Friday the 13th movies. It is that. Especially recently, I say recently, around this time. Is it 2009 remake of Friday the 13th? That's very slasher. It's all very generic, and it's just Jason being that's the one that this reminded me of the most, and it was kind of that kind of mixed with Evil Dead a little bit, obviously with the cabin dynamic and things like that. It's kind of a combination of the two of them, the genericness of the slasher movie, and don't get me wrong, Evil Dead is fantastic, and certainly the original, and even the remake I didn't mind either, but it is that it does touch on those kind of beats to start off. But where the film goes, and obviously again, that's enough, I'm not going to tell you any more plot details, but it's just really smart. And that's the word I can attribute to this film the most. The Cabin in the Woods made me really enjoy horror. Not just because of you know, I did enjoy certain horror films before. Of course, I featured some previously, not too many, of course. But I do remember this being a film that kind of got me more on board with the horror genre as a whole, because I wasn't a mad lover of horror before this. Yes, there was a few scenarios. Yes, a few have appeared on Five of the Best. But coming into Cabin in the Woods, I remember that being the first film to go, okay, yeah, I'm on board. I'm on board. And that's why you'll see, as Five of the Best goes in these coming years, there'll be more and more horror movies featured, because this was the film that went, okay, go on. You really enjoyed that? Go and watch the rest. And that's exactly where I was at after this. It's nearly like an advertisement for the horror genre in such a brilliant way. But the film itself, and I know I've talked about it as what it does and summarised kind of what the cultural impact is of Cabin in the Woods for the horror genre. The film itself is also brilliant. The performances are really good in that generic way. They're good because they are... I knew I would struggle to talk about this one, so apologies if I'm all over the place with talking about Cabin in the Woods, but I knew it would be a film that I can't really pinpoint just exactly what I love. But and again, going back to what was so good and what they were able to achieve with the generic nature of the setting and the scenario and things like that. But somebody like Kristen Connolly in the quote-unquote lead girl role, you know, the kind of Sydney from Scream or Laurie Strode kind of role, maybe not as forefront as those two in their respective movies, but having someone like Kristen Connolly, who I'll admit I'm not the biggest fan of her work, but she's really good in this. She's really good. Somebody like Chris Hemsworth, as much as he goes on to, well, we know what he goes on to after this, we don't even need to say it, but you know, for him to move on to that after this and being in more of a, you know, there was that transition from the early Thor movies to kind of Ragnarok and onwards, where he became more of a comedic character, and that was between these films. You know, Thor: The Dark World and Thor: Ragnarok. Cabin in the Woods was smack bang in the middle of that. And Chris Hemsworth is a funny guy. He has comedic timing, and he can do a role like that really well. And this was one of the films that I seen. He can do that. He doesn't get to be the lead in any way of this film, but he certainly brings a lot to it. I think The Cabin in the Woods is just great. I could you know, circle around the point, but I just think the cultural significance of what it does, as I say, for the horror genre, it just made me love and really appreciate. It's not like before this I didn't love a horror film. I think it's more like it emphasised why I do. It emphasised why I enjoy the horror genre. It emphasised what I enjoy being an audience member watching a horror movie. You know, and in addition to that, what it does with the dissection, the you know, it just takes the mick out of everything, but in such a brilliant way. The Cabin in the Woods is so good, and I really apologise, because that's been, you know, the guts of 8 minutes of me talking about this film, trying not to be, and I actually had to break into spoiler territory for the little bit for the premise, but it's such a hard film to talk about, because it's not linear, it's not the same way you know, a lot of films would be, you know, this is how it is, this is who you talk about, you know, it's like that. It's not like that at all. The Cabin in the Woods is a very unique film. It's actually one of the most unique films in any genre that I've ever seen, and I love it for it. The Cabin in the Woods is really, really just top quality. And if you're kind of teetering if you're on the fence on where you are with horror as a whole, and especially around that time, and again I go back to it of where it was getting a bit stale. Maybe the most interesting thing for horror movies around that time was something like Scary Movie, which that alone is a sad indictment of the genre as a whole. It reignited the fire of love for horror, and that's why, for me personally, maybe not the same for everybody else, maybe the horror hadn't waned, but for me, it really, you know, erupted my love for horror again. And then going in, you'll see a lot more, not only in Honourable Mentions, but in actual slots on 5 of the Best for horrors in the coming years, especially for this decade. And this is where I really got into it. Whereas the 2000s that we've just finished on 5 of the Best, I didn't have too many horror films, and that was the reason, because there was a few I loved, but not, you know, I didn't really love the genre as a whole. But now things have changed. And that's why I really love The Cabin in the Woods.
Number 2.
Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 is directed by David Yates and stars Daniel Radcliffe, Rupert Grint, Emma Watson, Alan Rickman, and Michael Gambon. Now, if you've been an avid fan of 5 of the Best, you'll know that the last time I mentioned Harry Potter, I said there was one more to appear on 5 of the Best. Where that will be, you'll have to find out for yourself. Well, here we are, at the very finale of the whole series, with the Deathly Hallows Part 2. Now, since we've talked about Harry Potter last, I've had a few films that I really think were the weakest, particularly in Half-Blood Prince, and especially in Deathly Hallows Part 1. So it's surprising that, and this is where my dilemma was, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 is probably my least favourite Harry Potter film. Half-Blood Prince is probably close to it. So having them two back to back was a real dampener, and I was thinking this series is going to go out for me. I know a lot of people enjoy those films, and that's fair enough. But I think it's hard to deny the quality of Around the Prisoner of Azkaban, Goblet of Fire, Time, and even through Order of the Phoenix was also a surprisingly good film. With the 3 of them in particular, and then obviously the introduction in the first 2 films, I think there's a lot to love for Harry Potter. But for Half-Blood Prince was the first one that I felt, okay, they've kind of dropped the ball a little bit here. Yes, I wouldn't even say the final act, kind of the last 20 minutes of the Half-Blood Prince is really good, but it doesn't make up for the film as a whole. And Deathly Hallows Part 1, I'm sorry, the Deathly Hallows Part 1 is just boring. It's as simple as that. It's not like it's got a glaring fault or anything. It's just dull. And I get in the scenario of what they're put in. You know, they have a scenario of they've got this evil cursed item. Then when they wear it round their neck, they are influenced by the evil within it. That sounds quite familiar. I wonder where J.K. got that idea from. But anyway, I digress. So anyway, but going into that, coming into this film in Part 2, I was like, right, I'm sticking with it. I've been here for that long. It's a series that, to an extent, I grew up with, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are in a similar boat. I went into the last one not with optimism, but with, okay, it's the last film, I'll go in open-minded. I think they really stick the landing for this last movie. I think they really recapture, and David Yates and just everything that was able to be put into this final film, the performances, the emotional scenes, the action scenes. It's quite an epic film, and I don't usually use that word because it's a bit cliche and it's a bit like something you would put on a movie poster. But it is an epic finale to the series, and it's a worthy finale. And it's not often you get that with so many things. We've had so many movies and television shows over in recent times and also back years ago that really were strong, but when it came to ending, they really dropped the ball. Harry Potter doesn't do that. Harry Potter actually regains its strength for its final movie, and that's a testament to everybody involved. But I mentioned there about the emotional scenes, and I think this is maybe the most emotional film of the franchise. Some of the scenarios with our lead characters, the core 3, but also, you know, people like Snape, Dumbledore in the scenario of where he appears, and just even someone like Neville. a lot of performances and parts they play throughout this film really. It's a rewarding as a fan, and for someone that is stuck with the franchise. And stuck with the franchise makes it sound like it's a chore to have watched these films. As I said, I enjoy, what would that be? So there's 8 films, and then of the 8, I enjoy 5 of them. So, is that bad? No, sorry, I enjoy 6 of them. Yeah, that's not bad innings, is it? Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows Part 2 really goes out on top, and I didn't think it would. I'll admit, I didn't think it was. I thought with Half-Blood Prince really dropping the quality, the film before this, the Part 1 of this, bar the odd moment of quality, really just... I found myself yawning throughout that film. It was just... And yes, the scenario is because of that. Whatever. But no. Is it my favourite Harry Potter movie? It's not. My favourite Harry Potter movie I've already spoken about earlier and years back. You can go and find that for yourself. I'm sure you could probably guess. You probably think to yourself, if it's not this, it's this. You're probably right. But for Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, and for someone like Daniel Radcliffe in particular in the main role, you can tell, having grown up with this film, and I'm sure you've seen the kind of Hogwarts reunion show or special that they did with a lot of the actors kind of reuniting, and that was really poignant to me, and I'm sure to a lot of you, that this is a cast that, you know, a lot of these kids, and which obviously leads to most of the cast, they grew up with this franchise, they grew as people through this franchise, and going out on top was something that they earned, and I'm so glad they did. But another performance I want to mention, and I have mentioned him previously, but Ralph Fiennes, you know, someone who is just fantastic in so many roles. Is every single role he's ever been in brilliant? No. But I think there's so... His batting average as a performer and an actor is just wonderful. And him as Voldemort is actually one of the best parts of the Harry Potter franchise as a whole. And he only gets introduced in the 4th film. So, yes, I know he's the overarching villain for the whole thing from the 1st film. But his actual introduction and his performances, and it is him from the 4th film onwards, he also brings a brilliant dynamic, and him and Harry, Ralph Fiennes and Daniel Radcliffe, they're kind of the core of the two of them facing off with the surrounding, you know, Voldemort's minions, if you like, and then all of the students plus the teachers and everybody on Harry's side. It does feel like an epic, and it does give you the chills or the goosebumps as a film fan, not only a Harry Potter fan but a film fan. And I'm glad that I stuck with it. I'm glad that I didn't check out after the last 2 films, and I stuck with it, because now I look back on Harry Potter, and I suppose it is always it's all about how you finish, isn't it? And for the film franchise to end on such a high, such quality, and such a rewarding experience for fans, it kind of wipes away the lack of quality in the previous 2 films. And now I look at the franchise as a whole with love and quality. When I think back to the Harry Potter, and obviously it's been over a decade now since we've had a Harry Potter film, and do not say the Fantastic Beasts films, because, and here's a spoiler for you, they will not be appearing on 5 of the Best, because they are not so good. I don't like them. Not for me. I like Eddie Redmayne, but they will not be here. But what I love about the Wizarding World, which I really hate how cliche that term is now, but what I do love about the world that they've built through these movies, and obviously through the novelizations as well, it's one that rewards being a fan of. And that's something, if you're a fan of anything in life, if you get rewarded being a fan and it earns your love, that's something that really, it deserves to be supported. And that's why I do really enjoy the final entry of this film. It makes me want to go back, and when I see this film, it makes me want to go back and start Philosopher's Stone or Sorcerer's Stone all over again, and just say, right, let's go through it. Yes, there will be peaks and troughs, yes, there'll be the great ones, yes, there'll be the not so great ones, but Harry Potter as a franchise overall, it deserves the cultural impact it did, or it had, and you know, it's still one of the most profitable and most talked about franchises today, even with it being, you know, what is it, 11, 12 years since the film was released. That shows. Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows Part 2 is a great ending to a great series of films. And I miss them. I miss the Harry Potter franchise as a whole. It was something that you didn't really realise how attached you were to it until it ended. And I don't know what way they would be able to expand it or extend it. But in some way, I'm kind of glad that if they're going to stick with these films, just stick with them. Don't be trying to prolong it. Don't be making sequels for sequel's sake, because we see what happens when they do that with other big franchises, that they try to reignite. All it does is just dampen the original. We don't need that. Let's keep the Harry Potter franchise as golden as it is. Is it perfection? It's not as a whole, but some of the films are just top tier quality, and Deathly Hallows Part 2 is right up there with them. It's a great ending. It's a really enjoyable experience, and to be a fan of Harry Potter, I'm glad I made that decision as a youngster, and through myself growing with the film, as I'm sure so many of us did. It's really good. However, it's not my number one, because my number one for this year is number one. Drive is directed by Nicholas Winding Refn and stars Ryan Gosling, Carey Mulligan, and Bryan Cranston. So here we are at the best of 2011, and it's Drive. And why is it Drive? Well, a bit like some of the other films I've already discussed, Drive was a film that I came to very late. Probably the latest of all of them, because I only seen Drive in the past year or so for the first time. I know it has that. A lot of people absolutely adore this film, but I really had never got around to seeing it. I never had anybody in my circle saying, you have to see this, it's so good. However, I was just on a streaming site or whatever it was, and I was scrolling through and I seen, oh yeah, there's that film. Okay, I'll give that a go. Basically in anticipation of doing this list and thinking, there's maybe a good chance that might appear as an honourable mention, or even, in the top 5, we'll see what happens. I ended up adoring Drive. I think Drive is my favourite Ryan Gosling performance. Is it his best performance? I think he's able to give more in other performances, but the stoic nature of his character in this is just, it's perfection from him. And you also have people like Carey Mulligan, who, around this time in something like Great Gatsby as well, not long after this is a kind of a shining time for her as well. And obviously my man Bryan Cranston, this is hot in the time of Breaking Bad, and what a man, and he adds a lot to this. But the bread and butter of this film is definitely Ryan Gosling. He is. It's also, again, I use that word when I talked about Limitless. It's just a really cool movie. And you're probably thinking to yourself, so he's got to the point of talking about this film that he loves and he just says it's cool? No. It's undeniably cool. It is one, and I hate how childish that word is, but I also can't find another word to use that exemplifies what this film is. I really think the tone that they were able to set and stick to throughout this film, and the tension, it's a really tense film, and I think that brings a real beauty from what it is able to do in the tension. Not tension in the way of like a horror film, but tension in a way that a movie is thrilling. But what this film does better than so many, it is its use of subtlety. Subtlety in film is used, it can be used in such brilliant ways. And when someone says to me, I can't imagine what scenario I'd be asked this question, but what's your favourite example of subtlety in a film? Drive. It's not really about the storyline. It's all about the symbolic nature, the subtle storytelling, the looks, and saying things without actually saying things. And that's something that is so good. I talked about this before. Actually, I talked about this when we talked about There Will Be Blood and No Country for Old Men around that year, which was... a lot of that is dialogue, yes, but actually a lot of things, and especially in No Country for Old Men, the things not being said are nearly the most important things being portrayed by the character, by the actor, by the performance, and by the director, of course. And that's something that really... I love Drive for what it does, because it isn't like you think it is. It kind of exceeds the expectations of what you would think a film like this is. You would think it was a generic driving movie that just... It's completely opposite. It's actually one of the better storytelling films. And for storytelling in a way that Yes, it involves the driving, and it sends the name. I mean, it'd be weird if it didn't have cars or whatever in this. But Drive really... It just unlocked a part of my brain watching this that I didn't know existed. I'm not a big car guy. I'm not someone that lives and breathes cars or, has done part-time work in a garage or anything like this. I'm not that guy. I'm not someone that, every day I'm thinking about my car or whatever the case may be. But this... I find everything about Drive just hits the right mark. It is such the scenario, the setting, even the kind of color palette throughout the film. It's kind of this kind of noir vignette of strangely kind of ambient colors. But then whenever the neon lights are shone through, that's where it's a really beautiful movie. Some of the scenes in this they could be like desktop wallpapers. Not all of them, of course. Yes, there's some very adult parts, very brutal scenarios in the film. But Drive just hits so many marks that it's impossible for me not to love it. And I think so many people would love Drive. And I've talked about this before, and a bit like what I was saying there about, I'm not a car guy, so that element isn't what sold me the film. It's everything else, actually. And that was something, I've said that so many times on 5 of the Best. It's not, whenever you, say if you're looking through your listings for a cinema, or you're going through Netflix or whatever the case may be, and you're going, I would like to see that, but I don't like that premise. The best example that I always give whenever I talk about this is Black Swan. Could I give a toss about ballet dancing? I just couldn't care less. But I really like Natalie Portman as a performer, obviously through things with V for Vendetta. And when I went and watched that film, it's not about... the story being told doesn't involve the scenario. Do you know what I mean? And that it's like that for this. It's like that for Drive. Yes, the car is a catalyst for a lot of the set pieces throughout the film, and the more memorable set pieces. Yes, it is. There is cars involved. Okay. And yes, there's driving involved, hence the name. Of course. But it's everything around that is what makes Drive wonderful. I was once this film ended and the credits rolled, I couldn't believe how much I enjoyed this. That genuinely, I went into this with a bit of expectation, just because, not as I say, not through my circles, but I know on the internet, and kind of the perception around the film is of a good one, that it is a good film and people do enjoy it. Not the greatest film of all time, but a film that people do enjoy. Once the credits rolled, I love Drive. I couldn't wait to go back and watch it again. And it just cements how this decade of dominance, as I would call it, for Ryan Gosling, and obviously there's a lot more of that to come. And I mentioned that with other actors, people like Bradley Cooper obviously has a lot of shining lights to come in the next years. But it's hard to deny that the 2010 decade is, certainly on the male side of things, is dominated by Mr. Gosling. He is in so many top tier performances, especially when we get to the latter side of the decade. He's nearly in every great film, and we'll get there when we get there. But this here, Drive, was the film that was like, okay, this guy's great, you're going to love him. Yes, he's been in a lot of things before this. Of course he has. It's not like this is his first ever film. That's silly to say that. But this was the one for me that was like, and a bit like what I said with Limitless with Bradley Cooper, obviously on a bit of a lesser level, and certainly on a lesser quality level film-wise, because Limitless is great, but Drive is on another level to that. But talking about the two, and there is that similarity and that parallel of Bradley Cooper, it's kind of the first role that takes him on to better things and bigger things. Drive, while I don't know that it takes him on to better things, because I love Drive as much as any performance that Ryan Gosling's been in. But yes, it is that similarity of the two, and they're two male actors that are going to go on to dominate this decade and carry through to the following decade, of course, as well. So Drive is so good, guys. Again, maybe if you're like me and you go, I don't really like cars, I don't know why I would watch that. I don't either. I don't care. I'm not a car guy. but I love Drive. What does that say about me? Who knows? Who knows? But I think you'll really enjoy it as well. You know, it hit every, you know, if you had a checklist of what a film what I wanted this film to be, it was nearly adding new things to check off because I just loved it. Loved it. Drive is absolutely my favourite film of 2011. So that's been 2011, a kind of mid-tier year. Yes, we've had some great movies, but overall the quality didn't exude the way it has in other years. It didn't really have the true quality. And yes, there's some great ones in there. Films like The Guard and Limitless. Listen, I love both of those films. But in truth, if there had been, you know, if this had been a few years back or a different scenario, maybe they would have been delegated to an honourable mention. That may be the case. But that doesn't mean I don't love them. And that's maybe a wider point as well. Just because they're honourable mentions and say they're 6th on the 5 of the best list, that doesn't mean I don't love them. So many of my honourable mentions, I would probably say I give about a 7.5 or an 8 out of 10. So does that mean I don't love them? No. That means, or even higher than that maybe, just depending on the scenario. 2011 was a year that was pretty set early for me. Once I looked at the list, the only one, as I said, was Drive. Once I went and watched that, it was like, okay, well, Drive is number one. No questions asked. But the other ones, Harry Potter was probably always going to be second for the significance and also for as much as I love it. Cabin in the Woods would always have been just before that as well. It was always just Limitless and The Guard were the two questionable ones. The ones from the honourable mentions, and you know I like going through the honourable mentions to see which were closest to getting in. There was 2. There usually is 2. There's maybe 2 or sometimes 3 that are really close to getting into that number 5 spot. And for me personally, The Guard got into that just on my list, and I really enjoy it. I really love the film, and it really hits the right mark. But there was a few in the honourable mentions of true quality, and none more so than Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy with Gary Oldman in one of his great performances. And I say one because he's been in so many great things. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was unbelievably unlucky not to get in here. And if we're talking about true quality of film, it's got more of a quality than both The Guard and Limitless. But for me personally, I enjoy both those films more. Yes, maybe on nostalgia, or more for the humour, or more for just it ticks the right boxes. But if I'm looking, you know, on what makes a movie great, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy would definitely have been at least in number 5 spot. As far as other honourable mentions go, Warrior, maybe an honourable mention to that, would have been quite close as well. Tom Hardy also, you know, another film for him that really puts him in what was to come in the coming years, and certainly next year, of what will become. The other one is Rise of the Planet of the Apes, my favourite of the Apes trilogy. The Apes trilogy is... or would it be my favourite? Maybe it would be Dawn. Yeah, maybe Dawn is my favourite of the Apes trilogy. But a trilogy that is real quality altogether. And I don't think, just with scenarios the way they are, I don't know that they would appear in any way of 5 of the best. Just with it's just to the level of what we have in quality. But that doesn't mean that... yeah, that's they're going to miss out. I'm just looking through my kind of draft lists of the next few years. And the Planet of the Apes trilogy does not make it on there, and that is a shame, because it has... If this was 10 of the best, it would have definitely been in there. But it's not. It's 5 of the best. So they were the honourable mentions that were quite close. The other ones just, yeah, I enjoyed them, but I don't think they'll ever make in the top 5. So yeah, 2011, a good year. A year that brought a lot and kind of set up a decade well. Was it the greatest year on memory? No. Is it the greatest year of quality that we've had in 5 of the best? No. But it really added so much in what it brought, and especially in something like Drive. You obviously have, and I suppose Harry Potter, you know, the ending of the Harry Potter saga, or whatever the term would be for the 8 films, that ending is the most significant thing that came out of 2011 movie wise. We know that. It was a movie event. Something like it was akin to something like Avengers Endgame, or any of these big kind of culminations of films. That was what that was. And Harry Potter, it had that significance, and now that chapter is over in film. Harry Potter, the chapter is finished, and now we move forward, and there'll be certainly some big franchises starting in these coming years, and I'm sure there'll be some that'll appear, some that won't appear, some will maybe just be honourable mentions. Let's see. But this series will continue to go month by month. I continue to enjoy doing this series. I love looking back on all these years of film. And of course, it goes without saying, these are just my opinions. I would never contest with someone else's films that they enjoy the most. I love these films. You might go, I hated all 5 of them. What are you talking about? I get it. It's all opinion. But for me personally, I just enjoy celebrating film. Yes, when in my other series I talk about films that maybe aren't so good, and just my initial thoughts on those. But for this personally, these are things that I really love. And whenever I go back and, even for me personally, when I go back and look through these videos and just say, oh yeah, I enjoyed that one, and I wonder, will they change over time? There may be a scenario where I go back in 10, 15, 20 years time, if YouTube's still a thing by then. It might not. We might be on, God, who knows what we'll be on in 20 years time. But when it comes to that time, and looking back and going through these celebrations of film, I just enjoy movies. That's what it boils down to. If you hadn't already got that feeling, I just enjoy movies. And it's as simple as that. If you enjoyed this video, and if you've stuck around, I appreciate you all so much for sticking around for these, because I know they're long videos. I know there's just listening to me chatting for a long time and going through the different movies, but I really do appreciate you all. You know that. And if you want to stick around and subscribe, and this is an ongoing series. We'll be going all the way up to present day. We're in 2011 now. Next year 2012, and we'll just keep her going all the way through. If you want to stick around, I'll appreciate you so much for it. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, let me know. And as always, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye, guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love, everyone.